everybody. Welcome to the Brightest Voices podcast. My name is Crystal, and I am so happy you're here. Here on this show, we get to interview incredible missionaries and hear their stories. And today's missionary is Mark Cloherty. Mark and his wife, Jennie, are currently strategic coordinators for refugees and full-time staff with Servant Partners. Servant Partners is an urban ministry based in Los Angeles, with teams working and living in urban, poor neighborhoods in 25 cities around the world. They are based in Miami, and their current role takes them all over Latin America. Mark and Jennie have been married for 11 years and have 3 children. They met on the mission field in Central Africa, working in the DR Congo and Uganda. And they have the experience of working in different contexts and have lived in Africa, Europe, and now the US. Mark is originally from the UK and Jennie is American. Welcome, Mark, to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you here today.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's good to be with you.
Yes, I'm ready to hear more about your story. Just you gave a little brief overview in the bio that you sent me, but I would love to hear about your testimony, how you came to know the Lord, how missions was laid on your heart, different things like that.
Yeah, well, you can tell my accent. I'm definitely not American. You kind of alluded to that in the introduction. So I'm originally from the UK, so from Manchester, England. I'd grown up in a Christian family, but kind of walked away from Christ in kind of my college years. After I graduated from college, I worked in London, in the city, in the kind of financial district of London, which is a little like Wall Street in New York, doing a kind of work which is totally different from what I'm doing now. So working for a big bank, big investment bank, working kind of long hours. And, I kind of began to question what my life was kind of about, I guess. So, I was kind of sat on trains going to my job an hour there, an hour back each day. And I had some friends who were involved in a couple of different churches in London, and it was through them that I kind of got connected with the church again and decided to give my life to Christ. So, so that's kind of how my journey began with Jesus.
Yeah. So what brought you towards missions?
Well, honestly, I'd always been interested in travel. So even before coming to faith, I always, liked to travel. So I was fortunate to grow up in a family where I was able to, I was given some opportunities to travel. So that was always kind of an interest. But then I also felt like that my kind of financial professional skills, that I could use them in some kind of way in mission to bless others, right? So I had gone through college in the UK. I graduated with a master's in economics, and then in London I'd worked for a big multinational company for about 5 years, done some professional training with them, and really decided that I could use some of it to kind of be a blessing on the mission field. So it was alongside understanding God's heart for the kind of broken world that we live in. Yeah. It was those things that combined to send me out into the mission field.
Yeah, that's awesome that you were able to get your degree and then you're able to bring that onto the mission field. Did you have I know a lot of missionaries have this kind of big grand, the Lord is obviously calling me to this place kind of moment. Did you have any of those kind of stories, or was it just a gradual process?
I think I had a particular interest at that point anyway in Africa, just because you hear all the stories of the poverty and the brokenness and everything. But I think if I'm being totally honest with you, that was probably combined in those days with one of those kind of white savior complexes that I could go out and save the world. With very little real grasp of how or what that would entail. So So yeah, the mission agency we originally joined was called MEDA, which was based in Europe, but would work in the kind of relief and development sector. So I went out to DRC, to Congo, to provide support for basically emergency health programs. Like the eastern part of the Congo has just been involved in conflicts on and off for years and years and years. It's kind of a sad place because it really shouldn't be dealing with those issues. You know, the impact of colonialism, just greed, corruption. You know, really should be a wealthy, fairly stable part of the world, but because of outside forces, it just isn't that way. So, so I had been, you know, maybe also kind of my pioneering spirit, a desire for adventure. I wanted to go to somewhere that was kind of, you know, maybe not quite on the beaten track, right? So,
yeah, that's awesome. So I'm curious to hear, in your bio, you mentioned how you met your wife on the mission field. So I got to know that story.
Well, Jennie had worked for the same NGO in Uganda, in kind of northern Uganda, for about 2 years prior to us meeting. So the team base for both of our kind of work was in Kampala in Uganda. So I was able to kind of spend some time there. Every 8 or 9 weeks or so, I would come out and spend at least a week in Kampala. And on one of those trips, Jennie was there too. So, and that was how we first met, staying in that house together. So, yeah, it is kind of a crazy story because we were both in pretty intense environments. We always joke that I kind of fooled her with my accent, that my accent makes me sound more intelligent than I really am. So Americans hear a British accent and they're like, wow, you know, sounds kind of sophisticated, but it didn't take her long to realize that wasn't the case. But you know, we met in Kampala and kind of discovered that shared kind of passion for ministry. You know, we kind of got engaged after 6 months, and yeah, it was one of those crazy stories of being out on the mission field, really.
I love it. That's wonderful. So from there, what brought you guys to where you're at now?
Yeah, I mean, after we got married, we did live in the UK at first, so we spent about 5 years living in the UK. So I worked with a non-profit. Actually ended up leading that non-profit that was working with refugees and asylum seekers in the UK. Jennie was involved in kind of non-profit work. When we had our first daughter, well, our first child, our only daughter, we have 2 sons and a daughter. Cora's now 8, but she was born in the UK. But when she was born, I think we began to think about coming back to the US. So Jennie wanted to be a little closer to her family. So we had originally moved to San Antonio in Texas. There was a Servant Partners site there that was church planting, so we worked with them there for 7 years. And this move to Florida is a fairly recent thing for us. This new role with Servant Partners is kind of just in the beginning stages. So, but yeah, we have this experience of working, I think, in different contexts. We, you know, spent 3 years in Africa, in the UK, and now in the States as well. So, so I think it's kind of given us maybe a unique perspective, right? We've been able to get that experience of being in different contexts, like thinking globally. So yeah,
that's really cool. So I'm curious, so you've moved around a lot, obviously. Whenever you've made the shifts to these different countries, was it kind of something that you guys, because you talked about with your first child, it was just kind of a decision that you guys made to be closer to her family. It wasn't necessarily ministry related. So I have all these shifts that you've taken just kind of been like life decisions that were not based on ministry, or do you feel like the Lord, he blessed you in those seasons and you've kind of fallen into ministry, or do you feel like it was specifically the Lord telling you for some of these things, move here, do this ministry?
I think it was probably a combination of both. When we had made the decision to come to the States, alongside the kind of decision to be closer to Jennie's family, we had also consciously been thinking about working in urban ministry on a full-time kind of way. So it was a combination of both. How can we do both? We kind of have these unique life situations where I'm English, Jennie's American. We're starting a family. There's some questions about how do we live alongside our families and be close to them, but also be involved in the kind of ministry that we feel God is calling us to do. So it was a mixture of both, I think. So, but there was still, there was definitely like an obedience thing in terms of the kind of leap to full-time ministry. So for sure.
Yeah. How do you personally, you and your wife, how do you decide when the Lord is calling you to something, and how do you know when it's kind of your own personal desires?
Well, I think the process for us into the call into full-time ministry was like a 3-year process. It wasn't a quick overnight thing. So I think you have to have people around you who you trust, and there's a process that you go through, a discernment phase. Unfortunately for us, in the kind of decision to ultimately join servant partners, that process itself involved a discernment process. So, but we had looked at some different avenues for full-time ministry, and all of them involved discerning some way what is God calling us to right now. So one of the big questions, I think, for me particularly was, we are now fundraising. We fundraise, we live on 100% support, and that was a big discernment process to feel like, is this what God is leading us to? So to not go back into paid work and be full-time in this work. So it wasn't an overnight thing. It starts with a small kind of seed. Maybe God is saying something, and through that discernment process, you're able to clarify exactly what it is. It starts to crystallize, it becomes clearer. So
yeah, I would actually love to hear more about, you said it was a 3-year journey. I would love to hear more about what that process looked like for you and the different things that you learned and experienced.
Well, it was full of waiting and a lot of frustration. I'm not naturally the most patient person. God has shaped that in me. So but we had spent time, talking with people in our home church back in the UK at the time, and we began just to step out in faith and get to know people in different organisations who were already working in urban ministry. We'd visited organisations in London, we visited organisations in the US, and we just, as we kind of made these connections, we began to get a clear idea of what it could look like and what felt right for us. So but yeah, we looked on a few doors that ended up, not being quite the right direction for us before we kind of came across servant partners. So we had to be willing, I think, to kind of say no at one or two different situations. That this is not quite right. We kind of started to look at this. It's not quite right for us. So but yeah, it was a lot of networking, a lot of connections with people who are in urban ministry, a lot of prayer, and waiting, really. So yeah.
Yeah, prayer and waiting, and it's not an overnight thing, right? It takes, the Lord works how he wants to work and not how we want him to work. Like you said, he's constantly teaching you patience.
Yeah, I mean, our temptation is we want to obviously rush things and do it in our timing, but yeah, through that discernment process, God is at work, right? Through that kind of, it was almost like felt like a 3-year transition process, but there's no doubt God was working throughout that time. So it's definitely not wasted. So.
Right. Amen. So I have a question that I should have asked at kind of the beginning of when you were sharing your story, but I'm curious to hear about your background. You had a degree in economics, and then you decided to transition onto the mission field. I'm interested. For me, I started my life as a missionary, not my life, but my adult life as a missionary. I worked overseas for 2 years on missions work. And then I came home and I got involved in the corporate world. And that was a very difficult shift for me. So I'm curious to hear the flip side of starting in the corporate world and then moving on to the mission field. And what were the kinds of thoughts that you had and the things that you experienced and the struggles and whatnot for kind of flipping career paths like that?
Yeah. That's a good question. I mean, I think it obviously was a big change. I went out onto the mission field initially with the idea of using some of those professional skills. So I think one thing that stands out is that, in my job with my big company, my finance role, I had a fairly defined role, right? I quickly understood out in Africa that my role meant I had to be kind of ready for pretty much anything. So but there's things that you can take from that corporate world, some of the skills, but the kind of efficiency, just communication skills, networking skills were all things that I began to learn in that job and were transferable. So I think those were helpful things. It was, my job in the DRC began as a finance role, supporting the kind of health program that was there in a finance role. I ended up supporting that program in security and logistics. I ended up managing and setting up a new base. I ended up overseeing the entire program in the DRC for 6 months, which was entirely unexpected. I wasn't prepared when I went out there to do that. So, but some things happened, and I asked to step in to do that. I found myself managing 300 staff in one of the most dangerous, poorest places on the planet. So, those kind of experiences I wouldn't have encountered those. I was following a career plan, right? A career plan. Right. And if people talk about what's your 5-year plan, what's your 10-year plan, and in Africa, all those things kind of went out the window. So, sometimes success there was just holding things together. So, so that was the big kind of contrast, I think. So, but there's no doubt that things you learn in that corporate environment are transferable. So, again, it's not a time that God wastes. I think he develops and hones some things that you can use in the mission field in that environment. So,
yeah, for sure. Did you feel kind of, when you were in the corporate world, did you feel like maybe something was off and then you got on the mission field and you were like, yes, this is where I belong? Or were you just happy both places, just kind of going with the flow?
No, I mean, I think back in those days I was pretty impatient. So I had a sense of what God might be calling me to, and I was like, I just need to go and do this. So, I mean, I think, again, you have to be careful of not jumping into something too quickly that's not right, So, those times, I mean, I guess the cliche is that it's those times where God is preparing you, right? But he's doing some kind of shaping work that needs to happen. So, I think for me, I got to a point in my corporate job where if I was going to progress in that career, they wanted me to travel. So, And like in a corporate job, that to me at least that wasn't particularly attractive. Like that meant staying in hotels, in fairly. It's not like I would be going to places and traveling and seeing lots of places. I would be stuck in offices and hotels, and
right.
I think that was ultimately when I really started to feel like, yeah, this is as far as I can go in this kind of job. So, but even after that, it still was another 18 months or so before I kind of finally made that decision to leave that job and go full time into that work out in Africa. So yeah.
Yeah, I love the theme of patience that's in your life, of the Lord growing your patience, and he takes a while to do things, but you've been faithful and you got yourself where you are now. So I would love to hear more about your ministry that you're currently in. Man, I can't talk today. But yeah, I would love to hear about the work that you are doing now these days.
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of work alongside refugees is again something that God has been developing for a while. So I think as we were in San Antonio, part of a church plant there, one thing that happened was that we were living in a low-income neighborhood there, but one thing we began to encounter over the last 3 or 4 years was many migrants from Central America who were moving into our neighborhood. So there would be families from places like Honduras, Guatemala. I'm guessing you can find them in most cities in the American South these days. So because there's been such a influx of people coming over from the border, but God began to speak to us about them and their lives. We would listen to their stories, what they were leaving, what they were fleeing, and then what they would encounter when they got to the US, the system they would have to go through here. And as we kind of had those experiences, building on what we'd already seen in Africa and Europe, God began to say, you need to think about how we can reach these people on a larger scale. So there's like 82 million, I think, refugees now. I think the latest figures from the UN. Wow. And now we've just had this kind of crisis in Afghanistan, right? It's going to increase again. So more people are being displaced through what's happening there. So, but our experiences, generally speaking, in whichever context we've been in, is that church often doesn't know how or even want to respond to some of these people. So they're kind of a nuisance. They don't give a lot of stability. You can't build a church on a group of displaced people, refugees and immigrants. So they often, like in the States, like a lot of these families will work 6-7 days a week sometimes just to survive. So but God began to catalyze something in us through our experiences there in San Antonio. We'd gone down to the border, and there was one trip particularly that changed a lot of things for us. In 2019, we went to spend a week with a ministry in El Paso, a ministry that kind of works in both El Paso and Juarez across the border in Mexico. And I think what we experienced that week really just God speaking to us a lot through that week. We kind of, what we saw was maybe about 1,000 migrants a day being released into El Paso, and US immigration was kind of dropping these people at the bus station, and they were like, "That's it, you're on your own." Wow. It was crazy. It was like it wouldn't have looked at a place in Africa. It was like these people were being cared for by churches. They would move into these emergency shelters in churches, but it was really intense situation. So I think that was back in kind of May of 2019, and that particular trip, like God began to kind of really speak to us a lot about looking at this kind of more globally.
Yeah. So what is the kind of specific day-to-day work and tasks that you do?
Well, I'll be honest, we're on sabbatical right now. So right now we're not doing too much in terms of direct ministry, but what what this will entail, I mean, I think our focus, like in terms of Latin America, is going to be particularly focused on Colombia. So Colombia, well, there's been a major kind of crisis in Venezuela. About 5 million people have left Venezuela in the past 5 years, and Colombia has taken about 2 million of those people. So in January, February, I'll begin to go to Colombia, and we'll begin to explore how we can connect the church there with the kind of migrants or refugees who are living in some of these cities. So I would say it's at the beginning stages for us, but there's this sense of people are moving around a lot right now. So, but just in Latin America and other parts of the world, people are still coming to the US border. But yeah, I guess we kind of see ourselves as a bridge, kind of a bridge between what's happening on the ground and then what's happening here locally in the States. So in connecting people, connecting resources, advocacy, but also mission work as well. A lot of refugees, as they become displaced, they're hard to reach with the gospel. So some of these people leaving Venezuela are not reached. They haven't been discipled. They don't know Jesus. So because of the instability in that country, there's just not a lot of mission work happening there. So missionaries have left and gone to other places, but it's crazy to think like a country like Colombia, which has its own issues, has taken 2 million extra people in the last few years. 2 million. So you can imagine what that does to a kind of structure in some of these cities. It collapses like the social kind of welfare system that was there. The system that's there to catch these people collapses under that pressure. So that's why we kind of think about holistic response, right? It's not just let's go and talk about Jesus to these people. It's let's think about how we can support them holistically. What are the things that need to be in place to support these families holistically? That starts with Jesus, but it develops from there. So it's got to be this kind of integral approach. So
I think it's super amazing that you're involved in, all things refugee and educating people on that, because a lot of times Christians don't really know what to do. And it's a huge thing in politics too, about all the stuff that's going on. So I think it's really important for Christians to know what the Bible says about it, to know how we can help, and just to know what our response in this is supposed to be, because it's a huge global problem, as you've talked about. So what are some you talked about holistic approach. What are some actual tangible things that if this is weighing on someone's heart, that they can do to start getting involved and to start making a difference?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a simple practical thing is wherever you are, whichever kind of town or city you're in, it's just trying to connect with a ministry or a church or a network locally that is reaching out to involved in that kind of refugee work. I mean, I think there's even small projects happening in small towns, because of what's happening in a lot of cities with kind of gentrification. The cost of living is so high. Some migrants end up living in kind of more rural places. So sometimes even in places like trailer parks. So I think wherever you are, there's a way just to connect with somebody or something that's happening locally. So sometimes it's big organizations, and there's lots of them, like the Lutheran Church, the Mennonite Church, usually have some kind of refugee response. So there's kind of bigger programs, and then sometimes there's maybe just one church that feels called to get involved in that area. It's just trying to find out where those people are. So, I mean, like you said, unfortunately, there are lots of churches who don't want anything to do with this kind of area of work, especially kind of when I think when we see what's happened in the American church, this kind of surge of nationalism, right? In parts, not all of the American church, but in parts of it. So there are some churches who don't want to be responding to this, but so I mean, I think that is the other question: is how do we disciple our people to understand that this is a biblical response, is to kind of welcome the stranger. So I've come across people who have been in really, honestly, very conservative churches, but feel God is speaking to them about this. And how do you kind of respond in that situation when you're kind of isolated in that way in your kind of response? So that's a difficult thing to face, difficult thing to think through. And so yeah, I think practically just finding what local resources there are wherever you are, which city, which town you're in, and then also thinking about, what can I do to help the response in my own context, in my own church where I'm already rooted. So I think those things kind of stand out particularly.
Yeah, I love that you're talking about, like, we need to disciple people to understand that this is an issue. What would be your kind of response, your discipleship? What would you tell somebody that doesn't necessarily believe that this is an issue that they as Christians need to get involved in?
Well, I think what I wouldn't do is try and argue with people, right? That's not, I don't think that no good comes out of that. I've been involved in one or two of those situations over the years where I've spoken at a church or I've met somebody who has been kind of very opposed to this kind of work. So I wouldn't get involved in those kind of discussions. But a simple way is going back to the Word. I think exploring what does God have to say, because people can't really argue with that, I don't think. Maybe it's introducing some of these topics in a Bible study, or maybe it's just finding out if there's even just one or two people in your church who might be interested in learning more about kind of this area. So, one of the main problems is it's just not taught about in a lot of churches. It's never spoken about. It's never taught about. So, there are some churches where people are getting their opinions from, cable news rather than from the Word of God. So, I think that's probably the best way. It's just to take people back to the Word, and let's try and understand what God is saying about some of these things. So,
yeah, I love that you said that, because actually one of the questions that I have written down is, do you have any Bible verses that you love to share about that are pertaining to refugees?
Well, I think you can always start with the story of Jesus himself, right, and his life, because he wasn't a middle-class white guy, so
right.
His story, Jesus' story, and what happened to his family, I think is one way of starting to look at this. But there's lots of other examples in the Bible. You can think about Moses and how his, he was a Hebrew, but he was born into this kind of privilege, because he was given away, and then he was found as he was kind of floating down the river. But he began to feel like, oh, I'm living as this kind of privileged person, but my people are being persecuted, right? And all the things that then subsequently happened to him, so that he had to leave where he was. And there's a consistent theme in the Bible, I think, of God using people who are not only flawed characters, but have been through these experiences, right? There's tons of stories. So Esther, the story of Esther, Mordecai is another famous story. There's lots of things to explore, but those are some things that particularly stand out to me. So I mean, you can go back to some of the older scriptures in Deuteronomy when God talks about caring for the widow, the orphan, but also taking care of the stranger. So I don't have the exact references in Deuteronomy with me right now, but caring for the stranger is one of those things that he talks about. So, and then you can just reflect on history, and as people have always been moving, right? There's always been some movement somewhere happening. So you can think about the Egyptians' persecution of the Jews, but there's always some movement happening. So, in the 20th century, we had 2 world wars, but then towards the second part of the 20th century, there was all of this stuff that started happening in the Middle East. And now we have this situation right now where it's happening all over the world. So it's happening in Latin America, it's happening in all over Africa, it's happening in the Middle East, it's happening in Asia. So it's kind of thinking about that history as well, and thinking, God has always allowed this to happen. This movement of people has been happening over time, and God has kind of allowed that. So, and what is he doing through that? I have stories from being in Europe, and even talking with friends there now, of Christians who have left places like Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan. But when they arrive in Europe, they're taking part in churches and bringing all this new life to churches there. And then they're also reaching out to their friends and their family who've grown up as Muslims. God is at work through this kind of move of people, right? He's doing something significant through this movement of people that's happening. So,
yeah, something that impacted me that you said earlier on was when you hear these stories of these refugees, it really touches your heart, and you personally experienced that. So I'm wondering if there's any specific story that you've heard from somebody that you're able to share that was really impactful for you.
Yeah, in terms of recently, I think, from my time in Texas, we met particularly a lot of people who were fleeing Honduras and Guatemala, those 2 countries. So, and it's not one particular story, but all of those people will tell you pretty much the same things, right? So the reason, firstly, they never wanted to leave their home country. Nobody ever does, right? Nobody wants to leave their home when they're surrounded by family, where they've grown up. But this kind of perfect storm of factors has come together to force them to leave. So it's a mixture of violence, gang violence in those countries that has kind of taken root and spread, that they don't feel safe even to send their kids to school. Their kids might be attacked on the way to school or kidnapped, that kind of thing. So the economy in these countries is kind of completely broken. They find it very difficult to find stable work and feed their families. High levels of corruption in all levels of government, going down to like the lowest level of like community police, that police wouldn't be trusted to deal with things. And then there's these kind of global factors like climate change. In Guatemala, they're experiencing like huge drought for the last 5 years. That these kind of factors are coming together to force people to kind of flee. So, and then if you put yourself in their shoes, you think, what would I do if I was in that situation? If I was thinking I can't provide for my family, I'm afraid, I can't trust. There's no integrity in the local authorities. It's that perfect storm of things that has come together to force people to leave. So, unfortunately, often the narrative we hear is, they want to come and take our jobs, or they want to come and take our welfare. They're not going to come and do anything. They're gonna, that's why they're coming to the United States. But that's just not what we've experienced ever. So,
right, yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing about this problem. I know it's something that a lot of people need to hear more of and be more aware of. And thank you for sharing your heart and the Christian viewpoint. And thank you so much for the ministry work that you're doing and the difference that you're making in people's lives. And thank you for, again, doing an interview. It's been great to meet you and great to hear your experiences and your heart. So thank you so much.